I'm glad to see everybody here. My knees aren't quite knocking. I have done this once or twice, so bear with me as we go through this tonight, because it has been several years since I've got up and taught a Bible class. But let's start with, are there any prayer requests or anything anybody would like to share at this point? Okay. Well, I will say Sheila's doing well. She's getting around without a walker or a cane right now, and she's got one more week of rehab on her knee. So thank everybody for all the prayers on that. So she's getting along really, really well. So, and she's not crying every time she goes to PT anymore. So either they're not doing their job or she's healing, one of the two. So, or both. So, all right. Well, let's begin with a prayer, and then we'll get into our class. Would you pray with me, please? Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you at this time to ask your blessings on this assembly and to help us to learn more of your word and the history that you have laid out before us. We ask you to be with those of our number who are on our prayer request and heal them and give them comfort. We ask that you also help our friends and other family members that are needing your hand on them to heal them and guide them in their lives. Lord, we ask that you'd be with Lanny and his family as they're traveling on vacation this week and next, and make sure he comes back to us so he can take this class back over in 2 weeks. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right, tonight we're going to back up a little bit. We're going to start in 1 Samuel, and we're going to cover King Saul. King Saul was the first, well, actually he was the second king of Israel, if you look at it the right way, because God was the first one. Which caused some issues and we'll find that out as we get into this. I want to back up and put a little bit of that in context where I talked about how Saul was the second king of the Israelites. If you look at it, when Moses came down with the 10 Commandments and presented those to the Israelites, that's kind of like the Constitution of the United States. That was the basis of all the laws they had. And then the books of the law gave them a religious and secular laws, how they dealt with each other, how they dealt with outsiders, and that was all handed down by God. So once the Israelites started thinking that they needed a secular king, then they were actually refusing God at that point. So that's something we need to keep in mind as we go through this study, because we're going to find out how Samuel will rebuke them for seeking a secular king as part of this tonight. The story of Saul, is found in 1 Samuel chapters 9 through 31. So, according to 1 Samuel 13:1, he ruled about 42 years, and then it's mentioned in Acts 13:21 that it was for 40 years. So he ruled about 40 years, and he became king at 30. So he was about 70 years old at the end of his days. And if you can't tell, I'm very much a facts and figures kind of guy. So you're going to get a lot of that, and then we're going to get into some discussion as we go. But if you think about it, he was a king. Started out fighting on behalf of the Israelites, and that's how he ended up dying. And if he reigned for 40 years, that means he was a 70-year-old man when he went to war the last time. And I was a soldier when I was 18 and in my early 20s, and there were things I could do then that I can't do now, and I'm only in my 50s. I'm not sure how he did it at 70. So, of course, today I'm also paying for the things I did to myself when I was 18 and 19 and 20. So, let's look at 1 Samuel 8:5. Let's start there and actually start getting into the text. This is where the Israelites first asked for a king. This is the elders talking to Samuel. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." That was their first mistake, because they wanted to be like everybody else. So, and were the Israelites supposed to be like everybody else? That'll be our first discussion question. What do you guys think? Were the Israelites supposed to be like all the nations around them? Were they supposed to be like everyone else, having a king? No. Okay, pagan worshipers. What else? would have set them apart from the secular kings around them? Well, one, God had actually handed down their laws to them, not an earthly king. And he had given them both religious and secular law to follow, all the way back in Exodus and Deuteronomy and the other books of the law. So they were not supposed to be like other nations. They were actually the called out, the elect of God, the selected of God. Okay. So when back to verse 6, but when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel, so he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, "Listen to all the people are saying to you. It is not you they've rejected, but they have rejected me as their king." That's pretty powerful. The nation of the elect refusing to have God as their king. Please jump in at any time if you've got something to add. So God's saying, "Go ahead, find some, or I will give you somebody." But he goes through what he did for them, starting in verse 8, about bringing them out of Egypt, that they were to forsake all other gods. But he also says, warn them and tell them what's going to happen if they have a king to reign over them, because he's going to claim his rights. And then he goes into what those rights will be. Talks about taking their sons, making them serve with his chariots and horses, run in front of his chariots, commanders of thousands, commanders of 50s, others to plow his ground, reap his harvest. All before this time, they were very much a tribal and clan group. So what you went out in the field and harvested was for your family or your clan. Now they're going to be giving part of that away to a ruler. Sounds kind of familiar. But another thing that Samuel does not point out here, when he starts talking about all the things they're going to be giving away, that doesn't change the tithes and the offerings that they're still supposed to give God. So at this point, their taxes went from this level to about double, just because they added a king and all that goes along with that. So there's a burden involved in that for those people as well. I don't think we've learned our lesson yet in a lot of cases. So he also talks about he's going to take a tenth of the grain, give it to his officials and attendants, male and female servants, best of the cattle, donkeys, all of that, a tenth of the flocks. So they're tithing on top of the tithe they're supposed to give to God at this point. So, but they still choose to ask for an earthly king at this point. That's not a lot of wisdom, I don't think. Because you've got, go ahead.
They must have not thought back several generations before about Pharaoh and their situation.
Yeah. Yep. So they go through all of this, and the Lord again says, give them a king. That's in verse 22. And then Samuel sends everybody back to their town. Well, at this point, we're going to look, and I want to point something out in 1 Samuel 11:18. So if you go to 1 Samuel 11:18, you're going to notice, as soon as I get that it talks about the men that Samuel get for his military are from Israel and Judah. We're already seeing the schism between the northern and southern tribes of Israel. This is kind of a foreshadowing of what's going to happen. 11:8 says, when Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000, and those of Judah 30,000. So you're already seeing that schism between northern and southern tribes. And this is at the end of the judges' rule, going before you've even really got a king or a kingship established. So you're seeing some of that's going to become an issue later on, after they start going into captivity and coming back. The other thing to look at whenever he selects Samuel, Samuel is anointed, or Saul selects Samuel and anoints him in 1 Samuel 9 and 10. And when that happens, Samuel does not tell anybody. He's from the least tribe, Benjamin. He's one of the least clans of that tribe, and he's the youngest son. Where else in the Bible have we seen an issue with a youngest son being put in authority over his family? Joseph? Yep. What about David later on? Next week you'll hear some more about David, but what about David? Wasn't he the youngest son of Jesse? So God's taking the least and raising them up to the greatest again. And that's going to cause some problems later on, I'm afraid. Then if you go to 1 Samuel 10, 17 through 27, they reselect the king in front of everybody. Now, he's already been anointed king. Saul's been anointed king at this point, but now they're bringing all the tribes and clans together and selecting by lot. And that's how they figure out that Samuel is the one there, but they can't find him because he's hiding with all of the provisions. Does that sound like somebody that really wants to be king? Not to me. So he knows he's been anointed by Saul, or Samuel. Okay, I've got too many S's running here. Samuel has anointed Saul at this point. Now he's selected Saul by lot. Saul is hiding with the provisions. Samuel asks the Lord where he's at. They send him and basically drag him in front of everybody. Now you've got God here that wants to be their king, and you've got Saul here I'm not so sure about. What do you think? Doesn't seem to? Does that bode well? I mean, it shows a humbleness to him, I think, or I don't know. I don't know if humbleness is the right word. But, you know, whenever his uncle asks him what did Samuel tell him when he anointed him, and he tells him everything except the fact that I've been appointed king. So. Well, I'm not sure if he wanted to keep it quiet or if Samuel told it. I mean, the text does not say that Samuel told him to keep it quiet. But his uncle, when he asks him, he tells him everything except that part at that point. That's what the text tells us. That's all I can address at that point. I mean, we can speculate. What he could have been ashamed by it or scared of the job. I mean, that's a big job. So I'd be scared of it. I don't want to run for president or governor, I'll tell you that right now. So, head of my place is enough for me. But, then if you look in 1 Samuel 11, chapter 11, verses 12 through 15. This is finally where the people acclaim him as their king. Up to this point, he's been anointed, he's been selected by lot, but not all the people were happy with that. But at this point, they actually ask for anybody that said anything against him when he was selected by lot previously, because they're going to put him to death. And he tells them not to. But they are acclaiming him their king at this point. So the people have accepted him after a battle. As I said before, he was very much a warrior king. He lived by the sword his entire life. But he started out as a farmer. Because at one point it talks about how he's coming back from the field with his oxen when he finds out that there's a town that's at great risk. Is this cutting in and out? I mean, do I need to raise it a little bit? Okay, just checking. So what really causes the fall? When we talk about Saul, what caused his fall? It went to his head. The first instance we have of that is in 1 Samuel 13. They're preparing for battle, and Saul is waiting on Samuel to show up to offer sacrifice on their behalf. And he's waiting, and he's waiting, and he's waiting. And Samuel's nowhere to be found. So Saul takes it upon himself to offer sacrifice to God. Yeah. Yep. And that's exactly what happens. As soon as he does it, Samuel shows up. So, and rebukes him for it. And at that point, what does Samuel tell Saul at that point? Okay, it's in 1 Samuel 13. Go ahead. Done a foolish thing. And what's the result of that foolish thing? He loses the kingdom. And then if you look in chapter 15, he decides he knows better than God does again at this point. This is where he's supposed to completely destroy the Amalekites. He chooses to save the best of everything for himself and his men, claiming he's going to sacrifice everything to God, when God's asked for the complete destruction of them. Now, one thing to remember about the Amalekites, you're going to see them again because they weren't completely destroyed here. And they will have a hand in his downfall overall. So how often do we have these issues where we take it upon ourselves? Like we mentioned before, we get tired of waiting on God, but how often do we decide we know better than God when he's given us a directive? How would that apply to us today? Somebody got an example of that? Think about the schism in all the churches. How many different churches are there out there? Would that be a man deciding he knows better and wants to go a different way? Could that be an example of that? Yeah. I will give you guys a bit of my family history. Most of you don't know me very well yet, so I'm going to give you a little bit. My mother's side of the family were the Interlines. And there was a town in Pennsylvania named after that family many, many years ago. And it was founded by a family whose 3 boys were all ministers. Started out at one church. Before they were done, there were 3 churches. All of the same grouping, but they had a falling out between each brother and founded different churches that each one of them was a minister at. So that one hits me a little bit because family history. But how often would we approach that as well? I mean, just think about how we would do that in our own lives. When we're reading something or something is said that we don't agree with, do we go look and see what God has to say about it, or we just decide on our own we know what's best? Mm-hmm. Yep. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and another thing to think about is with Saul, the description we have of him, he was a handsome man, a handsome young man that stood a head above anyone around him. So how often do we ascribe based on physicality? When we look at somebody and, yeah, that person looks like they would be upright, they would do a good job at this, how often do we ascribe that just based on what we see on the outside? Because when he gets to the point of selecting David, and I'm not trying to steal next week's thunder, but when he gets to the point of selecting David, and they're going through the family members, you see, this is a good-looking man. No, I don't want him. This is a tall person. I don't want him. Until he gets down to David. Could he have been trying to teach a lesson by picking the pretty boy the first time versus the man after his own heart the second time? He does. He looks into the heart. So even as old as these stories are for us, we can still draw things out of them today that apply to us. And again, I'm not trying to usurp next week, but when we talk about Saul and David, they have a very rocky relationship. It starts out, David's there to soothe him with the lyre. David is a very powerful warrior in his own right. That's why Saul honors him so often and turns into jealousy, like you said. And when you start looking through 1 Samuel, chapter 16 through 29, 16 is where David comes on the scene, and all the way through chapter 29 of this book is all about their relationship and how Saul first honors him and then starts trying to kill him, and how he chases him through the wilderness and all of that. And then if you look at Psalms, and we know David was a prolific writer of the Psalms, there's 5 different Psalms written during this time period, all about how God is protecting David from his enemies. And that's Psalms 18, 52, 54, 57, and 59. So those 5 Psalms are what David wrote when he was on the run. So obviously that weighed on him heavily, that he had his king trying to kill him. What else can we learn from the example that Saul set for us? Because this is an example for us, but what can we learn from it? Besides not being jealous, not being prideful. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I didn't get it out of the cookie jar. That's true. That's one of the things when we look at Saul. Well, I did this sacrifice because you weren't here. Or, I took these things. Yes, I destroyed all the men. I destroyed all of the weak stuff, all of the stuff that was no use to me, and kept the rest of it. Saul, he tries to blame other people, or he tries to justify what he's doing. And David does that a little bit, but not to the extent that Saul did, from the examples we're given. When you look at back again to where he was selected from the least tribe, the least clan, the youngest son of the entire clan, that's coming a long ways up from that end to being a king over a nation, a new nation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and there's a promise that God makes whenever they select Saul, of so long as you follow God's commandments, not only you, but your king as well, God will be with you. And that's the promise that God made to the entire nation of Israel at that time. And the thing about it, every promise God makes, he follows through on. One example, and I cannot remember where it's at, but one of the examples that has stuck with me my entire life is where he commands Abraham to rend the animals apart, and then the pillar goes between them, saying that if I break faith with you, you can do this to me. That's pretty powerful. So what do you think about the nation deciding they wanted a secular king? I mean, I've touched on it a little bit, but how would that apply to us today? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They think it's wonderful, but they don't have any idea what it is.
Mm-hmm.
You talk to someone that grew up in a communist country or socialist country, they don't paint such a pretty picture of it.
No, they don't. And the other thing is, when you look at what's the job of government, the job of government is to protect the people, but from whom? In this case, Saul was to protect them from the surrounding kingdoms that were trying to destroy them, the Philistines, the Amalekites, things like that. That was his role. But did he go beyond that role? When he started taking on the duties of the priesthood by himself, or the duties of the judge, because Samuel was the last judge at this point. This is when we're moving from the judges to the kingships.
It's in our nature, I think, to look at one person for some reason. I mean, back in college, we did a lot of psychology with teachers and educators,
Mm-hmm.
and they say you put so many people, like a jury, okay?
Yes.
I taught a jury at Bucher years and years ago, and it just played out to the experiment that we talked about in college. All 12 of us come into the room, and you got to pick a foreman. Well,
Yep.
okay, and as everybody starts talking, one person rises above
Mm-hmm.
because they seem very intelligent, they seem like that, so you make them the foreman.
Mm-hmm.
People like that, they want this king set up as tangible.
Yes.
God they didn't really see like human flesh.
Right.
And so they wanted someone they could be tangible. I think sometimes it's with someone we can manipulate.
Mm-hmm.
We can put leverage on a human.
Yep.
Because if we cry out, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And I
Yeah.
think there's underlying conditions. People wanted someone.
Or my fatted calf was better than your fatted calf. It was a prettier calf that I brought. So, I mean, and if I'm tithing to God and to the king, where's the best stuff going to go? The one that affects me day to day, or the one that affects me down the road eternally? Yeah.
It's leverage. I gave you the best that you owe me.
Yeah. And that's still happens to this day. It really does. So, yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
So why did God let them have a king? Why didn't he give in to them?
Let's talk about free will for a second. Because if God had absolutely refused them what they were asking for, instead of letting them go down that path and find out for themselves what that led to, would he have truly given them free will? And how many of them would have remained faithful? And I have to be careful in today's society saying this, but if I have a gun to your head and tell you to do something, are you going to do it? Versus if I say, I want you to do this, now I'm giving you free will over it. Is that two different paths to take? And we all know that God would rather have us there cheerfully than have to drag us in kicking and screaming. Right? I mean, I'm a whole lot happier with people that want to be around me than the people that I have to deal with on a professional basis a lot. So.
Yeah, a person who tested on this free will thing, he's talking to one at the well, said someday the father is seeking those.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's just it. Had he maintained his own kingship over them against their will, would they have been faithful anyway? They weren't too faithful anyway. And every time God set them on the right path, they would go down it for a while, and then they would decide to veer off. Every example we have, all the way from the Exodus forward, that's why they ended up in captivity. That's why, the northern kingdom was taken away, and then the southern kingdom was taken away, because of what they chose to do. So we can see how the examples that Saul gives us can apply to us today. What about Samuel's rebuke? The two times he rebukes the Israelites for this, the first one would be in 8:5, where they first asked for a king, and then in 1 Samuel 12, 6 through 25 was the second time he rebuked them. So in 1 Samuel 12, let me go back to 12. verse 6 all the way to 25. He reminds them about how the Lord was the one who appointed Moses and Aaron over them, brought them up out of Egypt. And then he tells them, I'm going to present evidence to you of what you have done. Because he talks then about Jacob and how Moses and Aaron brought them out of Egypt, settled them there, and then they forgot God again. Right. Yep. That's, yeah. Every time it's remember when God did this for you. But human nature is, what have you done for me lately? So, yeah, you brought my ancestors out, but what have you done for me? So, that's something we have to remind ourselves of often. I've got 3 kids, and we have to make sure that our children, it's not our faith that they work off of, it's their own as they grow. They start out with our faith, but they should end up with their own, right? Well, here it was the children that forgot what God had already done for their people. Along that deep faith that they needed from generation to generation. Have it inscribed on their hearts and minds. Yeah. Then when you get down to verse 10, it talks about they cried out to the Lord. They've sinned, forsaken the Lord, served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. Now they want to be delivered again. So, what can you do for me today? And we keep coming back to that theme through here. But then once they saw the Ammonites had a king that was getting ready to move against them, they said, we want a king to defend us. Okay. And again, what is the rule of government, or what is the role of government? It's to defend us. But where end? I mean, they're talking about from outside enemies, which, that's pretty common of what a role of government is, right? Protect us from others. So then he tells them, here's the king. This is who you asked for. And every time I read that in verse 13 where it says, now here's the king you have chosen, the one you asked for, it's almost like, see what you got? That's the feeling I get when I read that. Now that may just be my feeling, but that's the feeling I get of, you asked for it, this is what you got. Because you had God as your king. And in comparison, that's a pretty big change. He goes on and he just keeps telling them, this is what happens when you choose man over God. And then they have a huge storm come in because Samuel asks for it. And they realize that we have sinned against God by asking for a king. And that is actually found in verse 19. The people all said to Samuel, pray to the Lord your God for your servants so that we do not die, for we have added to all our other sins the evil of asking for a king. You asked for it and you got it. And they realize what they did at that point. Doesn't mean it's going to change their minds later on, though, does it? Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Well, go back to the Garden of Eden. What was the mindset with Adam and Eve? We want wisdom, but we can eat of this. And we shall not surely die was the lie they were given, and they believed the lie. Right? Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the fall of man, and I'm not trying to get into that doctrinal discussion, but when we talk about the fall of man, it all comes back down to what I want versus what God's told me in every case. Look like you've got something to say.
So I was just thinking that, this is the way it's been from creation,
Mm-hmm.
is that when we have a problem, we look to some man to settle it.
Mm-hmm.
But God has shown us time and time again, He's the one that take care of things.
Mm-hmm.
Israel had an awful problem with that.
Yeah.
Every time they got in trouble, they would turn to God,
Mm-hmm.
and as soon as things was good, then they
Everything's great right now, so we don't need him anymore. And one of the promises God makes each and every one of us is He'll never give us more than what He will always provide us the means to handle whatever He throws at us, or whatever life throws at us. They keep.
He gives us that escape if we turn away from it.
Mhm.
That's not what we want to do.
Correct. And that comes back to the free will issue we talked about a little bit ago. So, and I'm not against free will. I'm glad I have that choice because it makes it more special to me to have a choice. So, rather than somebody lording it over me and saying, you will do it this way or else. Because there's no free will in that path. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to 1 Samuel 31. We're going to go ahead and move to Samuel's death at this point. Because everything in between is where he's dealing with David, and I'm not going to step on that one. I want to leave something for next week. Remember, he was anointed at 30. He served about 40 years at this point. So he's about 72-year-old man at this point, and he's going to war. Carrying his armor. Well, he has an armor bearer with him, but if you're in a battle, you're going to be wearing your armor. And for my day-to-day job, I wear about 40 pounds of equipment. Back when I was 18 or 19, I could carry about 80 to 100 pounds of equipment and walk all day if I had to. I'm glad I don't have to do that anymore. But a 70-year-old man carrying armor and weapons and going into battle that lasts all day, sometimes late into the evening, that's pretty rough. I'm not sure I could do that anymore. I get too used to driving instead of walking places. But when we look at 1 Samuel chapter 31, he's fighting the Philistines. And Israel has fled before them, and they're at Mount Gilboa at this point. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, that's verse 2, and they killed his son Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. He's got one more son, which will come into play later, but those are his 3 sons that die with him in this battle. It says the fighting grew fierce around him, and the archers overtook him. They wounded him critically. And remember, Saul was a big guy. He stood head above anyone around him, and the archers have a good target. Because it says that Saul's there, his 3 sons are there, and his armor bearer is there. And these guys, the archers are on chariots chasing him. So he was wounded critically, and then he said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." And his armor bearer refused. His king's dying wish, he refused it. That would be tough to do. You are sworn to protect this person, and now they're asking you to kill him. That'd be something tough to do. Right? As God's anointed, correct. And that's just like, David, every time he spared Saul, it was, I'm sparing God's anointed. Whether he's my enemy or not, he is God's anointed. In verse 6, it says, Saul, his 3 sons, as an armor bearer, and all his men died together that same day. And then once the Israelites found out about Saul and his sons dying, they abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. So they lost the battle in a very spectacular way. In verse 8, it talks about when they came the next day to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and then they started telling all the Philistines about it. And I'm paraphrasing quite a bit, but would that be news for the Philistines, though? We have killed King Saul and his sons. That'd be a pretty big deal. If he spent the last 40 years fighting against you, that'd be a big deal if you'd finally gotten him, right? Not going into politics, but I am going to bring up, we're in the United States here, so it would be comparable to when we were notified that Osama bin Laden had been killed.
How many of us rejoiced?
Right. How many of us were relieved? Relieved. Okay, yeah. But I mean, that's kind of the sensation I get from this is they were very glad they'd killed one of their greatest enemies at this point. I mean, they spread the news far and wide. They cut his head off. They hung him on a wall. They wanted the news proclaimed in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in a temple, fastened his body to a wall, and let it hang there. So they are showing off the fact that they killed the king of Israel. And if you look down in verse 12, it talks about when the people went to recover his body, they recovered the body of his sons as well. So he wasn't on the wall by himself. Then if you look in 2 Samuel, we're going to jump into 2 Samuel for just a second. Let's see. I put a chapter down, but I didn't put a verse down, so let me find it. Be chapter 1. 2 Samuel chapter 1. Starting in about verse 6. To set the scene on this is where David finds out that Saul is dead. Okay. There is a young man that shows up, tells David what happened. This is where we find out that they were on the chariots, and the chariots and the drivers were in hot pursuit. Saul was there leaning on his spear. He turned around and saw this young man and said, who are you? I'm an Amalekite, the people that Saul did not destroy earlier. Stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive. So he's been wounded by arrows, and he's asking this person to go ahead and put him to death so he doesn't fall into the hands of his enemies. Same thing he asked his armor bearer in the other verse we looked at. But this individual wasn't as worried about him being the anointed of God. He goes ahead and kills him. And he says so in 10. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and have brought them here to my Lord. So why would he take the armband and the crown?
I've often wondered if he actually did kill Saul, or if he's just trying to sound like a big man.
Mm-hmm.
He did it, but previously it says Saul fell on his own sword.
Mm-hmm.
I've often wondered if this guy just, he stumbles along, finds the crown, finds Saul dead, picks up the crown, the armband,
Mm-hmm.
decides he's going to give David, maybe he's going to get a reward or something.
Yep. And I've often wondered the same thing. If he was just one of the people that came along behind the fact and just took what he could and ran. My Lord. Yeah. Anointed. Yes. Mhm. Yeah. So at that point, what's David do to this guy? Tells all his men, kill him. Because he's the one who says he killed God's anointed one. Even though this is the guy that comes to David and says, here's the crown, here's the royal armband, you are my Lord, your rival is dead. So was David a man after God's own heart in this instance? He does. But again, we go back to this was the anointed one of God. This was God's chosen leader of his people. He was the anointed one. This individual who was not of God's people and should have been destroyed by Saul previously comes up saying, I killed him. Now, chain of events time. Had Saul followed through with destroying the Amalekites, would this individual maybe not have been there for this to happen? The way he was supposed to, correct. Yep. We don't know the day we're appointed, correct. And we're in speculation right here on whether this person would have been able to kill him, if he's away from home when they destroy everybody else. But it's kind of ironic that the people that Saul was supposed to utterly destroy, one of them is actually the one that claims to kill him. So, something to think about. If God puts us on a path and we choose not to go down that path, it's our fault because we chose not to go that way, back to free will. But what does God do to us on the other end because of what we didn't do at the beginning is something to think about. Right. So there's even looking at the kings in the Old Testament, there's application we can look at on what we do today and how if we interact with God at this point. Has somebody got anything else to add? Okay. This is pretty much what I had to cover on King Saul. We didn't do a deep dive in his life. There's still quite a bit we could cover, but I would be covering a lot with David as well, and I wanted to leave some for next week. Luckily, I don't have to teach David. But as I was reading through the chapters that covered Saul, a lot of these things just came to mind about, for the instance, the Amalekite that claimed to have killed him at the end of it, or how it related to, Moses with the Ten Commandments would be kind of like our Constitution because all laws come off of that, and the Ten Commandments are at the most basic. That covers all of the law and the prophets. So everything builds off of those 10 Commandments, just like our laws do today. When we reject the laws that were given, what is that? How does that affect us later on? And I'm just using this as an example. Mm-hmm. Well, I have one even simpler than that I deal with on a daily basis. How many people think that 5 miles an hour of the speed limit, 5 miles an hour over the speed limit is okay? I have to agree with you on that it's not. But that's my job in my day-to-day life is to enforce those things. So, but yet you see that all the time. So, well, and you know, when you talk about the law and the prophets, it was the same thing. Don't work on the Sabbath. You know, keep the Sabbath holy. You're not to work on that. So when you get into reading some of the texts where you don't pick up a fig and carry it across the kitchen, but if you cut a fig in half, you can take half a fig across the kitchen, because that's not work. If your donkey falls down the well, you can't go get a rope to pull it up, but you can take your belt off, wrap it around the donkey, and pull it up with that, because now you're just adjusting your clothing. And those are actually examples of what the law would say. So, you know, we always push the envelope. We see just how far we can get without stepping over that line, and sometimes we move the line while we're trying to get up to it. So, well, has anybody got anything else to add at this point? Because that's pretty much my lesson for the night. I want to thank everybody for your comments and participation tonight, and if anyone is watching us, I appreciate your attention for us, and hope to see everybody back here again Sunday and next Wednesday night as well. I'm looking forward to next Wednesday night's class. So thank you very much.